Hi, and welcome to Magic Numbers. This is episode number 148, and it's that time of the year where I'm doing my deeper dive into the data. It's not necessarily linked to the current format. Hopefully, those findings are pretty universal. It is my prestige episode series where I'm not counting on much engagement, but I do enjoy making those because this is where I'm doing the blue skies research. And I'm not talking about the social media platform. I'm talking about things that don't have an obvious use, but hopefully with that analysis, you expand the depth of your understanding of the game, get those basic mechanics. Before we dive into that, I'd like to thank my sponsors, mtgazone.com. I would like to thank my patrons. No new patrons to report, but a bunch of people subscribe for free to my Patreon. And it's a good gateway drug to actually becoming a patron. So I would highly encourage you to do that. And of course, thanks to Bulkbox. Buy Bulkbox. It's good. You can use code SHARECO10 if you're in UK. But if you're not, still buy it. Even if I don't get anything, you will not regret it. And with that, we can move to the preamble. And this is the truth of Magic the Gathering. That's why it's not chess. You can maximize your skill all you want, but you can't deny that luck plays a part in Magic. And luck makes the most memorable moments in Magic true, because without this, oh my god, it's lightning helix stint, who knows if not the most famous Pro Tour play when someone just rips the lightning helix as the only out from the top of their deck. It wouldn't be as much fun as it is right now. And I think that the fact that sitting in front of a world champion, you know that your chances of winning that game are non-zero, is an amazing feature of the game. And that can only be brought by luck, because surely you're not beating a world champion on skill. Or at least I am not. So denying that luck exists is futile. And I think that it's good to know how much of it there is, and that's why I decided to make that episode, to try to figure out how much luck is involved in Magic. And spoiler, I'm not going to give you a full answer, because there is multiple layers of where luck can apply in Magic the Gathering. I'm going to quantify only one aspect of it, but hopefully we got like a decent number out of it. But also, luck existing is not an excuse for placing the blame of your losses on it. And I think that this is something that lots of people get trapped into when they say, oh, well, I lost because I drew badly, my opponent top decked something. Most of the games you could improve something in the gameplay. And, those small improvements very often lead to one extra turn. And as we often say, if only I had one extra turn. Well, the goal of Magic is to give yourself that extra turn by playing flawlessly before the step where you're too far behind. So admit that there is luck, but don't use it as a general scapegoat for everything, because it's not productive. It will stop your development as a player as well. I think that lots of players stop developing because they start blaming external factors rather than focusing on things that you can correct. And we're going to show that even with bad luck, there's plenty of opportunity to improve what you're doing. And I do have a question of the week from one of my newish patrons, Nate W. That question has been asked a couple of weeks ago, but I didn't have the data to answer it. And finally, I got to got the right data to answer it. And it's, how do DFT cards perform in multiples? Specific question was about migrating Ketradon, but I thought, once I analyze Ketradon, why wouldn't I add some extra cards on top of it? So I divided those graphs into sort of themes. And this is the theme of good green cards and Velohard Bike, which is not a bad card, but it's just not at the same level as the rest. I think Velohard Bike for me is the sort of baseline for the green cards of how they improve in multiples. Because problem of testing, what happens when you have multiples of a given card, it is ridden with a lot of biases. So first thing, if you get 3 Hazard of the Dunes, then green is probably open. And now you have a big question. Am I winning more because I have 3 Hazards of the Dunes? or am I winning more because green was atrociously open and green is a very strong color in the set? And, it's a mixture of the two, but you cannot just exclude the fact that just being able to draft free hazard is a signal that green was open in many of those drafts that are in that category. So Velohard Bike I took as a sort of medium power green common, and you can still see that multiples of Velohard Bike are improving your win rate. And I think that I will sort of treat it as this baseline for how good the card is. So I would say generic common in green would behave like a Velohard Bike, which means that Ketrodon does see an improvement, but it's not like a major improvement in terms of the win rate in multiples. But you can easily play 3, of course, if you can draft 3. At the baseline, when you have one Ketrodon, the win rate of those decks was 56.7%. And with 2-3 copies, you get up to 57.5%, 57, 58%, that kind of range. And it's very similar picture with Hazard of the Dunes, starting at 56.5, then going to 57, 57.5. Exactly the same with Gibrick Omnivore, which again is a signal to me that it doesn't really measure the quality of multiple Ketrodons, but it measures the quality of being able to draft multiple Ketrodons and so on. But Gibrick Omnivore 56, if you have one, 56.7 when you have two, 57.5 when you have 3 of them, and very similar numbers for Pothole Mole. The card that shows a bit different is Stampeding Scurryfoot, where it starts at this 56.5 like the rest of them, but then quickly jumps to 58 when you have 2 Scurryfoots, and goes to 59.4 when you have 3 of them. And because I had enough data, when you have 4 Stampeding Scurryfoots, you get 61.7% win rate. To give you the impression, I tested all the cards in the set in all kinds of combination of numbers. And of all those cards, including singles of like, the Frog God and whatever, Stampeding Scurryfoot in 4 copies was the 4th best win rate of the whole set. So the card is really good. And the fact that it increases to 59.5 rather than 58 like the other ones when you have the 3rd copy tells me that Scurryfoot is a card that actually is way better in multiples, unlike Ketrodons, Hazards, Gibrick Omnivores, and Pothole Moles, where you see an improvement with multiple copies, but that improvement is not due to multiple copies, but because green was open. And we end with the Velohard Bike, which starts at 55.5 and goes to 56 and then 56.8 or something. So there is an increase when you have 3 of them. And I highly doubt it that it's because of the fact that having 3 Velohard Bike is a good thing. It's probably because having green very open is a good thing. Then we have the black cards, and we have Tale of 2 commons. First, Pagdol Terror, where having 1, you have a win rate of 54.3. Having 2 goes to 56, quite a dramatic increase. Having 3 is 57, and having 4 is around 59% win rate. So Pagdol Terror is a card that is not amazing as a one-off, but it decreases dramatically when you have multiples. And the other common that has a very different pattern is the Wreckage Wickerfolk. By the way, I only took sample sizes of over 1,000 games. So if there is a bar in this graph, as you can see, most of the cards don't have a bar for the 4th copy because there was just not enough sample size. But if there is a bar, that means that the sample is at least somewhat credible. But Wreckage Wickerfolk is much better as a one-off. Pagdol Terror had a 54.3. This one has 55.5 as a one-off. Then still pretty good as a two-off. It goes to 57. 3 Wickerfolk is 58.6. But 4th one is actually decreasing the win rate. It goes down to 56.1. And of course, there might be variance there, so I can't exclude that this is partially due to variance. But it seems to me like 3 is the magic number of the Wicker Folks. You don't want to have more than that. And then we have those control cards that potentially, you don't mind having multiples, but are not maybe as important as the Pagdol Terrors. We have the Spin Out Grimbobble and Engine Rat. These all start at the similar level as the Wreckage Wickerfolk, which just shows me that Pagdol Terror is just particularly bad when you have only 1 copy. you want multiples, and they work much better in multiples. It's too many wicker folks in your deck, Sierra. It's I counted the copies in the deck. So yeah, Spinout starts at 55.6, Grimbobble at 55.8, Engine Rat 55.9, and they go up to 56 when you have 2 copies, Engine Rat even 57 when you have 2 copies, and then stay around 57, 57 and a half when you have a 3rd copy. So I would say Packed Old Terrorists definitely want to have multiple copies. Wreckage Wickerfolk, yes, you want to have multiple copies, but you don't want to have more than 3 potentially. In case of white, we see similar patterns for the 3 commons I selected. We have Broadcast Rambler, Ride's End, and Voyager Quick Welder. And I say similar, I think that the Voyager Quick Welder's pattern is slightly different. But Rambler starts at 54.5, goes to 55, goes to 57 when you have 3 copies. Very similar for Ride's End, 54.5, 55 to 56 to 57. Voyager Quick Welder starts lower at around 53. It even drops down when you have 2 copies to 53, but less for 52.9. But when you have 3 copies, it all of a sudden goes to 56.3. And I did notice that Voyager Quick Welders in multiples are just very, very potent, because casting one on turn 3, if it survives, being able to cast another one and cast a 3-drop or something like that is an amazing curve out. And of course, it's still a very good curve out with the Broadcast Rambler, but even for that, you want to have multiple copies of both Quick Welder and Broadcast Rambler just to have it consistently happening, because it's not such a great card to draw late in the game when you're just drawing a card and playing it for turn, and mana is not the limiting factor. This card is probably way, way better when you cast it on turn 3. And to cast it on turn 3, you need multiple copies, because that will maximize the probability of you casting it on turn 3. And that's why it has a different pattern than the other 2, in my opinion. And the last thing we have is the is it kind of card collection. First things first, Flood the Engine starts at 55%. If you have 2 or 3 copies, it goes up to 56, and it goes up to almost 59% when you have 4 copies in your deck. Which means that when blue is open, when you can get that many Flood the Engines, they are actually quite good. Then we have Lightning Strike, just to show the difference. And Lightning Strike, 1, 2, 3 copies, stays at around 54%. Increasing the number of Lightning Strikes does not increase the win rate. However, if you have 4 copies, it goes up to 59. And then again, it's very hard to interpret. What does it mean? Does it mean that if red is insanely open, it means you can benefit from it? Is it the variance? It's really hard to say. But it's interesting that at least that adding those 2nd and 3rd copies doesn't seem to have a big impact on the win rate of the card. Unlike in the case of Flood the Engine, where you see this market jump from 55 to 56 when you add an extra copy. And then I have 3 sort of cycling payoffs. First is Magmakin Artillerist, just to show you that not all the cards in the set have the same pattern as you saw in the previous graph, because you might draw that kind of conclusion if you are watching the graphs. Magmakin, first copy, 51%, 51.7 to be precise. If you have 2 copies in your deck, 50.8. If you have 3, 49.6. And if you have 4, 50.2. The important part in here is that also there were enough decks that run 4 copies of that card to get more than 1,000 games in my data set to give me the data for 4 copies of it, which means people play that card way too early, way too often. And there is some early data in this data, so that might be the reason. People earlier in the format were trying to test if that was good and try to play multiple copies, and that some people were super high on it as well early in the format. I heard some content where they were claiming Magmakin Artillerist is actually a decent card. It just doesn't look from the data. It just goes from 51.7, which is already not impressive, to 50.2 when you have 4 copies, or even 49.6 when you have 3 copies. This is not the kind of numbers that I'm enthusiastic to see. But then we have 2 very different cards from the Artillerist in Mako and Scourging Skyray. Both of them, if you have only one copy, 52.9. This is not impressive by any stretch of imagination. But if you have two, they both go into 53.7 for 54, that kind of range. And when you have three Makos, they go to up to 57.5. When you get three Sky Rays, you go to 59.1. I didn't test the interaction, what happens if you have a combination of three Makos and Sky Rays, but I'm pretty sure it's going to be similar. That just shows you that if the cycling deck or this discard deck is open, and you can get multiple copies of those uncommons, you are in for potentially a very good deck. Of course, the problem is when you pick the first Mako, you don't know what's going to be open. As a weirdly hilarious anecdote, I was playing my FNM draft last week, and I was drafting a Demir deck, and I somehow ended up with three Makos, just picking them late because no one was interested. And then I regretted not getting into that lane because I could have had a deck with three Makos and a couple of boardside barrages, and I just passed it along and didn't have it, which was a shame. At least I do have three Makos for my constructed deck, so there is some small bonus for drafting them late from the packs. And the last card, and that data was honestly a bit mind-boggling for me, is Thunderhead Gunner. I do love a Gunner. I think it's a great card. But from the data that I've seen, the having one copy was 54.2, which is decent and reasonable. But having two copies only increased the win rate to 55.6. And having three copies was actually detrimental when you had 54.8. Which makes me think, sort of a card that you want to draw one copy of in most of your decks. So I don't think that there is a particular need to go all in on the Gunners when you see them in your draft, because it doesn't seem like adding extra copies is bringing up any kind of benefits for you. And I also have a non-patron question. Non-patron question for many reasons. The question is from Johnny G from Canada, and those of you who follow the Pro Tour might guess who that is. The question, paraphrasing, was, what's up with that card? And the picture was of the Spire Mech cycle. And the reason for the question was from Johnny from Canada, was that a lot of pro players are very high on that card at the same time as the data shows that the card is not behaving very well. And I thought, okay, since we have that kind of question, why not go slightly deeper on the vehicles? Because it's one of those sets where we have vehicles in every color combination. So it would be interesting to see some of the data that is involved in the vehicles. And I do have to say, I was doing it very independently, but someone in my Discord, which I cordially invite you to join if you're not yet joining, made the graphs that were showing the density of vehicles and the win rate. And they were great. And it was an interesting analysis. And I was already doing this thing while they did their thing. So they did publish their things first. So I want to give credit. Unfortunately, I would have to go to Discord and screen through who exactly was that. But you know, if it's you, you know that you did it first, and I fully give you credit for that. Oh yeah, for me it was also a personal story because a week ago, Carl Serap, also known as Terry Bud MTG, had a deck list posted. They went 4-0 in a preliminary on MTGO with it. So excuse me for the picture quality, but it's from Modo. So what else do you expect? And the deck was 41 cards. Come on, Carl. You can do. Is every Carl obsessed about putting 41 cards in their deck? Anyway, and Carl was asking which card to cut from the deck. And my response to that was somewhere between the Gustle Blockbuster and Mech Cycle for me. And then I got a response for another player, Kai B. I'm not going to get name drops here, just try to make it anonymous. But Kai B from Cologne mentioned that Mech Cycle is one of the best cards in this deck, question mark, exclamation mark. I didn't respond to that because I have a suspicion that Kai B might be pretty good at Magic, so who am I to teach them? But what makes it that so many really high quality players enjoy that card, and data is so atrocious for it. I decided to investigate a bit. And first things that I wanted to check: how does the density of vehicles in deck impact the win rate? And the news is not so great for the vehicles, honestly, because if you have 0 vehicles in your deck, the average win rate was around 55.7. And if you have 1 vehicle, goes down to 55.5. If you have 2, stays the same. But you add the third one, 55. You had 4 vehicles, 54.5. 53.5 when you have 5, and it goes down to 52 when you have 6. Then there is a slight bounce back, and you have a 53% win rate when you have 7. Mind, this is already based on the smallish sample sizes. Not so many decks had 7 vehicles in them. But I think that bounce back is linked to some synergistic cards that want you to have the density of artifacts, of vehicles. And indeed, artifacts. And I did the same graph for as a function of vehicles and mounts in your deck. It looks very similar. It's just that the dip is at 8 vehicles and mounts, and then there is the bounce back to 54% when you have 9 vehicles and mounts in your deck. So it's basically extended by 2 because you probably will have 7 vehicles and 2 mounts in your deck sometimes. But that means that in both cases, the best win rate is having 0 of them in your deck. And then I thought, okay, but this is a very generic graph. How does it look like for each color pair? And this graph was also done in my Discord by the same person that did the graphs I mentioned before. And again, I'm going to then put them 2 by 2 in terms of color combinations because, well, it would be too messy if I put all 10 color combinations on the same graph. I tried. Trust me. But here we have Golgari, which actually does pretty well with the vehicles. 0 vehicles means the win rate is 55.2, or maybe 55.4. But then it decreases. Like if you have 1, you get to 56. And then the optimum is between 2 and 4 vehicles for Golgari decks. And then your win rate is around 57.5 to 58. Yeah, and when you have 5 vehicles, there starts to be a drop off, and you go back to 55.7 or something. So for Golgari, you have this optimum number of vehicles in your deck around 2 to 4, and of course, this is driven by cards like the Broodwagon. For cards like the rare Golgari vehicle, which is great, the Carrion wagon. That's another one that is playable. This is not based on sort of, well, obviously you don't want to put mech cycle, but this is based on those value kind of vehicles, the ones that act as a gravedigger, the ones that act as a removal spell. All those things are going to be good in Golgari, and Golgari has plenty of those high quality. Debris Beetle, thank you very much, Timber Trannel. But then we have a second color, and that's Rakdos, and Rakdos has a dramatic drop with the number of vehicles in the deck. 0 vehicles, Rakdos deck, 58% win rate. You add 1, 57, you add 2, 55, you add 3, 54, and you add 4, 52% win rate. It's very dramatically dropping line if you see the graphs. But for those of you that listen to the podcast, generally, Rakdos doesn't want to have a single vehicle in their deck unless it's maybe like, I don't know, Boombill or something. And this is linked to the quality of the vehicles in Rakdos specifically. You're playing an aggressive plan, so a bunch of artifacts that are good in grindy matchups instantly are not as interesting as they were. You are attacking your opponent's life total. You want to be as quick, and that means curving out with creature usually prevents the fast clock. Furthermore, you probably also want to have a relatively quick access to start the engine max speed. And vehicles are not really helping in that aspect. So I would say if you're trying to draft Rakdos, I would avoid vehicles quite heavily. Then we have Gruul and Dimir on the same graph for some reason. One of the reasons is that the graphs are similar, but very different at the same time, because they go sort of hand in hand. Both of them are quite level in terms of number of vehicles they want to be having in the deck. For the between 0 and 3, they have the win rate of around 55, maybe 56% until 3 vehicles. But then at 3 vehicles, something happens, and it basically seems Gruul decks don't want to have a single more than 3 in their deck. 3 is the maximum that they want, because at 4 they already drop off to 54 and a half, and at 5 vehicles in the deck they drop down to 52% win rate. But with Dimir, it's quite the opposite. At 4, you have 54.7, very much like Gruul has. But if you have 5 vehicles in your Dimir deck, you go up to 56.5%. And that's actually the highest value for Dimir. Dimir is actually the more vehicles, the better. And it has to do something with artifact synergies that are quite abundant in that color combination. But generally, Gruul, you're happy to play a couple, but try not to do more than that. Dimir, if you are in the artifact synergy decks, you want to put as many as you physically can. Obviously, put the good ones up. I don't want you to put the Wrangler wagon or whatever it's called. Then blue-green and blue-red. I was expecting that blue-red might have this spike of putting many vehicles being good, because I thought, you have the cycling ones and you have push the limits, so maybe there will be the spike at the end of the curve where when you have 6 or more vehicles, you're going to have a higher win rate, but nothing like that materialized in the end. Having 1 is slightly better than having 0, because at 0 you have 53% win rate, at 1 you have 54.5, but then it drops back to 53.5-ish, and from then on it slowly declines, and at 6 vehicles in the deck, your win rate is only 51. And blue-green looks very similar. Here, even having 0 is more beneficial than having 1. You are ending up at 58.3 or something like that when you have a 0, and you drop down to 57 when you have 1. And then it sort of continues on the similar downward trajectory as Izzet did. At 5 vehicles in the deck, you will have the win rate of around 55.5. These 2 colors generally don't want to be playing that many vehicles, and there might be a subset of decks that really are happy having multiple numbers of ironclads in the Izzet deck. However, it's not detectable as such by the data, so I can only speculate about it. What I think this graph does tell me, on the other hand, is that the blue-green signpost uncommon vehicle is not that great, because if it was, we would see a small boost at having 1 or maybe even 2 vehicles. We don't see that, which means that it's sort of suggesting me that the card is a bit of a trap, and that computes with statements from some other content creators I've been hearing about. Then we have white, black, and white, green. They are almost twin graphs, where it's fine to have up till 4 vehicles in those decks. I would say probably driven by the Broadcast Rambler, but maybe a couple of others here and there. Broadcast Ramblers, you're quite happy playing 3, as we have seen in the previous graphs for the card frequencies. So they have around 56-ish% win rate up until 3 vehicles. At 4, there is a slight divergence. The white-green decks are still fine at 4 and have 56% win rate. The white-black drop off a bit and have only like 54.5. And then stays stable for the Orzhov decks and drops even further for the white-green. White-green at 5 vehicles is 54% win rate. So these decks, they can play some vehicles, but you're not that fast. I mean, take it or leave it. And last question, yes, last exclamation mark color pairs is Boros and Azorius. These are the ones that should be technically interesting, because these are the colors where the vehicle synergies are most pronounced, I guess. And in case of Azorius, you do see something. Like, first of all, we didn't even have enough data points to find decks that had 0 vehicles in those 2 color combinations. They started 1. And having 1 vehicle for both of those decks is around 51-52% win rate, that kind of range. But white-red decks stay at the same level. It goes up to almost 53% win rate when you have 4 vehicles in the deck. But that's by far not sufficient to make me excited about playing vehicles in Boros decks. And then it even drops off after that. So having 6 vehicles is worse than having 1 at 50.5%. Azorius, on the other hand, they do have a bit of a signal here, because they start at 51 exactly when you have only 1 vehicle in the deck. And then it jumps jumps to 53.5 when you have 2 vehicles, and then still continues climbing until the 4 vehicles data point, when the win rate becomes almost 55%. And then there is a slight drop off after 4 vehicles. So with 5 and 6, like 5 has 54.5 win rate, and 6 just below 54. So Azorius looks like it can handle vehicles pretty well, and you shouldn't be worried about putting too many. Just make sure that you have enough ways of crewing them, or making them as such that they don't need crewing anymore. Okay, but that brings us back to our Spire Mech cycle and Johnny G. I looked at the win rate as a function of the vehicles and mounts in the deck, but I only look at the decks that had either 1 or 2 mech cycles. And there is painfully little difference between those 2. Now, obviously, the deck with 2 mech cycles starts at minimum 2 vehicles in the deck, because it has 2 mech cycles, duh. And the deck that has 1 mech cycle starts at the having 1 mech cycle in the deck data point. And I have to say, having mech cycle as the only card and no more vehicles is linked to a good 56.5% win rate, which is not terrible in any way or shape or form. But the more vehicles and mounts you start adding, well, the win rate drops instantly to like between 51 and 53, and it stays in that range without showing any kind of trend downwards or upwards until you get 10 vehicles and mounts in your deck. And when you have 2 mech cycles, obviously sample sizes for some outcomes were not large enough, but you started around 50% when you have 2 mech cycles, and then it bobs and weaves between 49 and 53% win rate to finally drop off to 47 for 8 vehicles and mounts in the deck with 2 mech cycles. So there is no clear signal of spots where mech cycle can be much better than the data would suggest. But combining this information with maybe looking at the archetype data, I guess it can be a good 1 off, maybe 1.5 off in blue red. It's probably fine to play in white red, honestly. It's just not fine to play white red in general. But if you play it, you shouldn't be ashamed of putting the mech cycle. And potentially maybe a copy will maybe good in Gruul. Now, in Rakdos, generally, you don't want any of the vehicles. And I didn't look specifically at that in the data, but I think that Severior Intuition has some merit. I would think that Black-Red would want it as a top-end card, but not leaning on any synergies, I think. I just think that this is one of the traps that people fall into this card when they see it. They try to build too much around it and try to put too many vehicles to be able to crew it and get some counters because that's exciting. While in fact, reality is that casting it on turn 5, tapping it top there to attack with it, and going face is probably the best option that it has. No need to overload with those vehicles. 1 is enough. But yeah, it would be interesting to see what percentage of those decks with 1 vehicle in black-red are the ones that have exactly 1 mech cycle. And since I did this analysis, I had all the code ready. I just needed to change the name Spire Mech Cycle to the name Push the Limit, and I did the same graph for Push the Limit, just trying to see how good is this card when you have 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6 or 7, whatever vehicles. Now, interestingly, one deck played Push the Limit with without having a single vehicle in the deck. I found one deck in the dataset that have it. Of course, it's not included in here. As I said, I want to have at least 1,000 games sample size to look at it. And 1,000 games is not much when you think that it's only like 130 drafts, basically. And you should evaluate card power by drafts rather than by individual wins. But Push the Limit obviously has a very low win rate when you have few vehicles. And yet some people still played it. I blame the first week drafting and trying to do some weird things by players who are not yet comfortable with draft. And in both of those, I look at the vehicles and mounts. So I look at the win rate as a function of vehicles plus mounts, because Push the Limit can return mounts as well as vehicles to the battlefield. And of course, it doesn't. It is not that it can return. It does return. You can't refuse to return them. Push the Limit in your deck, one copy of, when you have only 2 vehicles in your deck, gives this card a win rate of magnificent 39%. And then there's the skyrocket jump. If you have 3 vehicles in your deck, the win rate is already around 52. And it stays around 50-52 level until you have 7 vehicles. And then there is a small increase at the end, where like when you have 8, 9, 10, you see a small increase in the win rate for those categories. So if you have one Push the Limit, the more vehicles, the merrier. But weird data here, and part of it is this small sample size, but part of it is probably something that is objectively correct. The sharp optimum for decks with 2 times Push the Limit is 4. You don't want to play more than 4, and then after 4, you see a significant drop-off. I was thinking how to explain it, or at least how to make some kind of a viable hypothesis around it. And I guess the only explanation I came up with was that in those Izzet decks that will want to discard vehicles to the graveyard and build something and then finish the game by casting Push the Limit, you also have a lot of looting, rummaging, cycling. You can just do those things and feed your graveyard, but because you're doing so much of card advantage and card selection, those vehicles eventually will find their way into the graveyard. So you don't need to overload on them, because you're almost more keen to mill it, surveil it to the graveyard or whatever, than to draw it, because you would rather cast normal creatures, I guess. Okay, we can go to the main topic now. And the main topic is, how much luck and skill is there in the draft? And I'm going to focus on the particular one, because, of course, Magic has, as I mentioned in the preamble, luck at multiple levels. You have luck in your draft, you have luck in your pod quality, you have luck in your games, and all those things accumulate. Thank you very much for the raid, Scuffle, by the way. It's awesome, and thank you very much. Scuffle is definitely someone that is worth recommending to watch, streaming a lot of limited and playing sweet decks, as we heard just today. Play the Push the Limit, which was the topic of the seminar until just 2 minutes ago. And of course, there is also another layer of luck involved in league drafts, where you're playing on the ladder, you're playing outside of your pod, and this means that if your pod was particularly strong in terms of card quality, and some other pod was particularly weak in terms of card quality, you have an intrinsic advantage because you had access to better cards. This is something that is very specific for the ladder, and yet most Magic drafts right now are being played on the ladder, which means that this is the normality of how it goes. So in pod, you will share a large part of the card pool. So if the general card level is low, you're not going to see very good cards. Also, if you are an extremely good player and your pod is filled with people who don't know what they are doing in the format because they are either beginner players or don't know what's going on, most of the good cards are going to be passed, and you can predate on those and get a busted deck, while someone who is in a stacked pod with really good players is going to struggle for playables because everyone knows where it's at, and everyone will compete for the best cards, so you will see fewer of them. And yeah, as I said, outside of your pod, you will compete against players with a diverse range of pod strengths, and that's part of the luck involved, and that's the part that I'm going to be trying to analyze today. Okay, easier said than done, but how do we look at the pod card strength? As I said, different pods will have different cards open. Some will have cards that are slightly stronger. Some will have cards that are slightly weaker. And this diversity of pod strengths, that's the hypothesis for today, does impact win rate of decks. So what I did is I told the computer thing to draft based on the 17 lands draft data. I took 10,000 drafts and I told them to redraft every single of those drafts based on what was in the packs. And I gave it specific orders, and specifically I told it to take the best win rate card from each pack for each color pair. And basically from each single draft, I made 10 simulated drafts where one was I'm forcing Azorius, one was I'm forcing Boros, and so on and so on, and forced each 10 color pairs. And then I calculated the average win rate of the 10 or 20 cards that top 10 or 20 cards that in those lanes, and that my very rudimentary bots picked. And then I compared it with top 10 or top 20 cards that were actually played in the deck by the player who was in that draft based on the 17 lands data. And that's how it looks like. So the range of the pods average strength for the best 20 picks here. I'm showing the best 20 picks for each color pair. And this is the average win rate of the 10 color pairs. So not to skew it to some kind of busted open lanes, I tried to look at what is the average strength of each color, because I wanted to, like, some pods will have green very open and then green color pairs will have very, very high win rates. I wanted to balance it with the fact that the Boros will have pretty low win rate there, to somehow limit the impact of those extremely open green pods. But generally you see that most of the pods will fall into this range of around 56.5 up to around 58% win rate. So just a 1.5% average win rate difference. But when you think about it, this is 1.5 percentage points difference across 20 cards, which accumulates quite dramatically when you look at the deck. If you will be playing a deck and your opponent's every card is 56.5 win rate, and your cards each win rate is 58, you're going to be winning a lot of those games because every single card is better than every single card that they have. And at the extreme ends of those distributions, you have few pods that are extremely outliers. So you have some things that go down to 56. You will some things that have go up to 58.5. So they will be like those super extreme outliers. But I would say 80% of the decks will fall between 56.7 and maybe 57.5. So quite a narrow range of not even a 1 percentage point between them. Then I did this. Oh yeah. Then for the ease of interpretation, I divided the pod card power into 10 sections. And for most metrics, I'm going to use exactly those 10 sections because I didn't want to bother with those numbers, because even now I'm struggling to say 57.5. So I'm just going to give them arbitrary power, where 1 is a poor card power and 10 is the great average card power. So I divided them into equal 10 batches, where each batch contains around 1,000 decks. And yeah, the weakest ones were ones, the strongest ones were tens. And this is the first interesting. Oh, yeah. And yeah, so what I calculated was the optimal win rate for drafting. This is optimal because if you decide to force something, you're going to get all the best cards for the forced color, because you know what you're going to be drafting and you're not thinking about anything else. You're blind bot that wants to be drafting only the best cards. Now, the problem with that, of course, is that if you hit the right lane while forcing a draft, you're great. But if you hit a bad lane when trying to force, you are screwed because there isn't just no good cards in that particular color pair. That's why we never draft optimally, or very rarely we draft optimally. Most of the time, what we do is we're going to pick some good card first, then maybe another card, then maybe some third card that is pretty decent will come in, and we're going to pick it from another color to hedge our bets. And by that, we pass a thing that might have been potentially a top 20 card for our color combination. Some cards are not great in multiples. Like a combat trick can have a high win rate, and my bot will pick as many of those combat tricks as physically possible. But probably you don't want to play 4 of them in most of your decks. So you will pick one and you'll be happy with having it. Maybe you will pick the second one, but you will never pick a third or fourth combat trick into your deck, with some very notable exceptions. Like, for example, Maximum Overdrive from the set. I didn't put it in my graph of which cards are best in multiples, but for Maximum Overdrive, 2 seems to be the limit. After 2, there is a sharp drop off of win rate. So you don't want to put multiple copies of that, but my bots will. So they artificially inflate the win rate by not thinking about what would be actually beneficial for the deck. And sometimes you need 2 drops, so you're going to pick a 2 drops over a much better card that costs 5 mana. And my bots will never do it, so they might end up with a deck that has, I don't know, 11 5 drops, and it doesn't make any cohesive sense as a deck. But because of that, our drafting will not be optimal for win rate. And at the end of this seminar, I'm going to argue this is great. This is actually amazing that what we're doing there. And yeah, you have dirtling, switching colors, and pivoting late into something that you find open, which is also not optimal, because if you pivot into white at pick 9, you probably pass like 3 good white cards that you could have picked if you were in the white from the beginning, but maybe there was not a good open lane for you to start drafting white at that stage. So because of that, there will be a disparity between our between my optimal bot draft that optimizes for the win rate and what we actually do. And of course, there is a fourth option of why it will diverge. It's that some people just draft suboptimally because they don't know which cards are the best. And that also will happen. So I also calculated the outcome of the draft. How does the win rate of the top 20 cards look like for each draft that I analyzed? So for those 10,000. And I sorted them exactly the same like I did with the previous graph, from the lowest average win rate to the highest average win rate. And it looks quite interesting because the pods that are 10 and the drafts that are 10 are quite close to each other. There is maybe like 0.2, 0.3 percentage point difference. And as we go backwards towards 9, 8, 7, the difference between the optimal draft and the draft outcome, and by the way, these are not paired. So, I mean, the fact that this is a 6 here and this is a 6 here doesn't mean that they come from the same draft. They are just ordered increasingly. So it just shows the 5,000th highest pod strength draft is 57%, and the 5,000th highest draft outcome is 56.2%. So there's 0.8% difference already here. And it increases until we get to the weakest pods and the weakest draft outcomes, where the difference is already something like 1.5%. So that's a big difference, considering that there was a very small difference at highest strength draft outcomes and pod strengths. And this means that this divergence, I think, because if it was only because of dirtling and picking cards because they are better for the deck and not necessarily best in the win rate, I would expect those lines to be relatively parallel. But because they are not parallel, I think that this divergence between those two lines represents the lack of skill and drafting in a non-optimal way where it could have been drafted in the optimal way. This is making bad picks that small may they be, in the end results, especially in those lower draft outcomes, in particularly low win rate of the deck that you're drafting. So I think it's a cool graph that basically shows bad drafting in a visual way. But of course, we want to compare, does the pod power determine the outcome of the draft? Because this graph doesn't show that, because we mixed up the results. And maybe, you can get a super strong draft deck from a pretty weak pod. And vice versa. Maybe you can get a pretty weak deck from a pretty strong pod. So how strong is the effect of the pod card power on the outcome of the draft? And here we have the cloud of points with those 10,000 drafts plotted. There is a modest positive trend, which means the stronger the stronger the pod, the better the outcome. And here we have the strength of the pod on the y-axis, and here we have the strength of the final draft. There is a slight increase as we go along, so stronger decks come from stronger pods on average. But this only explains like roughly 10% of the variance. So the lack of your pod is only responsible for 10% of your wins, which is not nothing, don't get me wrong, but it's not a huge effect. If pod strength was the determining factor of the success, all this cloud that is spread across the graph would have been in a very small area around this diagonal line across it. And as you can see, it has a huge tail of other explanations. How do I determine the wins? I determine the wins from the data. The data has whether someone won or someone didn't win. And here I'm looking at the win rates from 17 lands. So basically, I look at the average win rates of the optimal lines versus the average win rates of the lines that were determined by the players. But okay, 10% is still quite a lot, and that is as much as the draft pod strength determines. So if the draft pod strength in terms of card power does not determine the win, how can we limit that luck factor? Can you make your own luck? Is getting a deck better than the pod power possible even? And does it result in better outcomes? Now we're going to be looking at the actual results of the draft games. So first of all, I looked at the difference between the pod power, this number, and the draft power. What does it mean? Okay, if it's 0, that means that if my pod strength was 5, my deck strength is also 5. If it's 1, it means that if my pod strength was 5, my deck strength was 6. If my pod strength was 7, my deck strength is 8. And it goes the same for -1. If my pod strength was 5 and I drafted a 4, this is -1. And what you can see from this graph is it goes from -8. So some people manage to get into a 10 power pod and draft a 2 power deck or something like that. The maximum is 7. So some people went on the 3 power pod and drafted a 10, or went to a 1 power pod and drafted an 8. And there's a clear linear connection with it. Or is it even linear? I would say anything when you draft below the performance of below the power level of the pod that you were in. So if the number is negative, you have a penalty. And if you go -8, the win rate of those decks was 44%. If you go -6, 50%. -3, 51. And it goes up to 53, 54-ish, that kind of level. And if you draft exactly on par with the power that your pod provided, the win rate is 55. And it stays around that 55 for quite a long. So if you overdraft your pod by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, you still stay around 55. And then only when you overperform by 6, 7, you increase to 57 to 59. And I did this graph. It's nice to know that there is this positive correlation. So overperforming the power of your pod is going to lead to winning more. But then I thought, okay, but here maybe all those things are quite even, because if I was at the pod that had 1 power and I made it into a 4 power, it's still not a great deck. So I'm not going to be winning much more than I could have been, and it's still determined by the pod power in a sort of way. So I decided to go a bit deeper and make it more granular. And I decided to look at it based on how powerful was my pod. And I made this beautiful matrix. I know that my audio listeners particularly love when I make massive 100-field matrices when I cannot read anything. But what you can see here basically is the link between the pod card power and the improvement. So instead of looking at all the decks between 1 and 10 and clustering them together, I'm going to look at what happens if my pod power was 1 and I drafted a 1 power deck. And so the difference between the pod power and my lane was 0. Well, the win rate is 46. But if I was in a 2 power pod and I drafted a 2 power deck, all of a sudden it becomes like 50, 52. And then, this is probably some variance in there. But if you draft on your power until the level of 6 of your of the pod card power, you stay around 50%, 52% maybe. Once you get to 7 power pods, this all of a sudden becomes closer to 58, 60, 62%. So if you are in a strong pod and you draft accordingly to the pod power, you are doing very well, and you're winning 60% of your games. But what is important in this matrix are the external diagonals. These show you basically what happens when you draft a 1 power deck. And it doesn't matter if you were in the 9 power pod, or if you were in the 4 power pod, or if you were in the 0 power pod, your win rate when you draft a 1 is going to be around 45 to 47%. That's going to be it. Similarly, with some variance potentially, if you drafted a 10 power deck, it doesn't matter if you were in the pod that has 4 power or 7 power or 10 power, you're going to be winning around 60 to 63% of the decks. So yes, Carl, that's a very good thing. When you suck consistently. That's true. So the power of the pod doesn't determine it that much when you are drafting a particular power of the deck. However, if you're drafting at the level of your pod, you're going to do much better when your pod is strong. That's as simple as. So we did this. Then I decided to look, okay, how do players fare based on their win rate bracket? In 17 Lands data, when you have the public data sets, you can see the number that says player win rate bracket. And this means it's the long-term win rate of that player. And 56 means it's somewhere between 56 and 58 or whatever. Or maybe between 54 and 56. One or the other. It's around 56% your average win rate when you're in the 56% bracket. And this graph shows clearly, but with some kind of variance again. So it's not like those super clean, weird graphs that I never could grasp as a biologist. How can data be so reliable? But this one is a bit more messy. But you see that the weaker players, the ones that have a lower win rate, underperform their pod reliably from going one level below below your pod power through half a level below the pod power. Then at around 52% bracket of the win rate for players, they become positive and they consistently overperform what the draft pod has to offer them, until you get to like 64-66% win rate players that overperform what the pod gives them by an average of 0.7, 0.6 marks. This means that part of the skill that you can learn, and there is no good excuse for not learning it, is to overperform your pod. And good players do that regularly, and this is part of the reason why they're good. On top of that, of course, you can apply the gameplay ability and skills that are much harder to get, but overperforming the pod is one of the easiest skills you can acquire. You just need to study the data and think about how to build decks, how to build plans. I had that come up in my coaching sessions recently quite a lot, where figuring out what functions are missing in your deck is a very important skill, and that will continuously let you overperform. Picking the right cards, making sure that your first few picks are data driven, even blindly sometimes, is a good first step. Once you get better in draft, obviously you can do more improvisation, but I think for the people who are starting drafting, I think that there is nothing wrong with making the first 8 picks based on the game in hand win rate or games played win rate, for example. And then from then on, starting to figure out what their lane should be. I think that would give you a net benefit in terms of your draft quality when you do that, and then abandon the win rate picks after pick 8 and then move on with picking by what you think is the best thing for your deck from then on. Anyway, this is a learnable skill, and as you can see, overperforming what the pod has to offer you is linked to a higher win rate. This is a very similar version of this graph, just to show you that there is not much difference in what the pod has to offer on average to each player bracket group. They are roughly having 5.5 average of this power level that I created, but top players, top win rate players will draft 6.3, 6.0 power decks from the same average power of the pool, while 44% win rate players will draft more like 4.5, 5.0 level decks. So there is again this linear kind of correlation between draft outcome and player win rate bracket, while you don't see a very significant trend when you look at the pot power between those groups, which means that it's randomly-ish distributed. And this is one more take on the similar graph. This is how many decks from a given power are drafted in pods of different power. So lowest card power pods are the ones, and 20% of the drafts on 17 lands that were in the pod that had 1 power ended up with a 1 power deck. But then, 17% ended up with 2, 16 with 3 or 4, 10 with 5 or 6. And then we see a drop of 6 with power 7, 3% with power 8, 1% with power 9, and 0.1% with power 10. And that's probably a generous 0.1%. If I remember correctly, there was one draft that someone had a pod with the power of 1 and ended up with a 10 power deck. And this linear kind of correlation shows me that this is people trying but failing because it's not very easy to do. So basically, if you are ending up with this 1 power deck, you should be hoping to end up with a 5 or 6. Hoping for more is pretty unrealistic. When you have the highest power pod, a 10 power pod, 36% of the decks end up being 10 power as well, which is impressive. And then 15% end up as a 9, 11% end up as an 8, and then it slowly goes down. 7 power decks are 7.7%, and 1 power decks are 4.7%. And it sort of goes there very, very gradually. And this is a big difference. The fact that this one goes super linearly and goes to 0 almost at the end of it, while this one sort of flattens out and stays the same, indicates to me that the fact that so many decks from 10 power pods end up to being 1 and 5, between 1 and 5 power decks, is a testament to mistakes. This is another graph that shows that people make mistakes in their draft and end up with weaker decks because of that. If it was based on bad luck and picking a lane or something, it would be different, and it would be maybe an interesting exercise to take those decks from a pod that had 10 power and ending up with power 5 or below, and trying to see what exactly went wrong with that. Are these people that are forcing a color blindly, and because of that end up with a poor deck because, yes, the pod was power 10, but their specific color pair was not good? Or are these people who are drafting odd decks where win rate is not a good predictor? There are plenty of possible explanations of that, but I think that skill is one of the strongest ones. Oh, the good question from Carl77, newly crowned top contributor of tonight. That sort of can tell you if a set is a Prince set or not, or rather sets that have higher discrepancies in win rates versus other cards' colors. Yeah, I mean, I think so. I think that some other graphs that I'm going to be showing in a second might be even a better answer to that. But I think that there is a way of looking at princeliness of the set through the lens of that. Of course, the problem is that with the Prince and Pauper are very badly defined, and I think that some months/years ago I made one episode that tried to look at princeliness of the sets through the lens of data. So I would encourage you to look through that through my back catalog, my very rich back catalog of the seminars, and try to find that one. And generally, yeah, I think that for anyone that is interested in those universal trends between sets, I try to record one episode every format that looks at this very specific data. Most of the time, I'm also bringing it to limited resources. So expect hearing similar things in limited resources next week, because I think I'm booked for the next week. And I'll be definitely talking with luck and skill, especially if LSV is there. So here I decided to look at the differential between the pod card power and the impact of the player rate. And well, first of all, you can definitely see that the player win rate has a big impact on what's going on with the pod card power. So players that have 40% win rate are winning 38% of the games in pods that have 1 power, and players that have 66% win rate win around 62% when they have pod 1 power pods. But 40% win rate players, they have a relatively consistent win rate across the pod powers. And this is the skill differential that I'm talking about it. And this is like why I so much like the comment of Carl77, when you suck consistently. Unfortunately, this is a correct conclusion from this graph. If your win rate is low, it doesn't matter if you're in a strong pod or in a weak pod, you end up winning 40% of your games, which means that there are some fundamental problems. But this is also partially good news, because if there are fundamental problems with your drafting, it means that the solutions are usually relatively easy. They require some work and they require some assistance or self learning, but they are solvable. And as I said, looking through the win rates of 17 lands, starting to draft with the win rates is one of the easy steps where you can improve your win rate very rapidly when you're at that level. And then as we go up with the win rates, you start seeing a slight trend. For example, people at 52 win rate, they weak pods, they have a win rate of around 50, 48, then it goes up to 50, 51, 53, and ends up at 56% win rate. So there is some increase already when you look at them. Top players, the 60% win rate players, they also start lower, 60, 61. Then it goes up to 63, 64, 65. even touching the low 70s when you're having 66% win rate across the long term. So there is a slight trend. It's not like super strong. So the pod card power is not bringing that much in terms of win rate. When we look at the deck card power, that's a different story though. Although it's not very different when you look at the low win rate players. They also have pretty similar win rates independently of the power of the deck that they drafted. Independently of the deck that they drafted was a 1 or a 10 in terms of the win rate through my metrics, still around 38-40% win rate. When we look at the top players, well, if they draft a 1 deck, they only have a 56% win rate. When they draft 8, 9, 10 deck, it goes up to 68-69% nice. And even at the 52% level, players that have 52% win rate, if they draft a 1 deck, it ends up 47.8. But when you draft a 10, you all of a sudden go to 56%, and it increases quite. So it's very funny that the higher the power, that the win rate of the decks with lower power for the weaker players is higher than when they have a strong deck. Part of it is variance. When I analyze that many categories, sample sizes are not going to be majestically huge. I think that there's probably like 250 games per each of those squares, which as a general trend within the graph is fine, but maybe it's plus minus 4 percentage points, which can make the variance, especially on those extremes of the distribution. And here I before that I looked only at the top 20 cards of the deck, and I decided to look if there is a difference when I look at only top 10 cards. And there is not much difference. I still see a very similar trend. Not much trend within the 40% win rate players and thereabouts. The higher the win rate, the stronger I see the trend in terms of link between the deck power and final win rate. And then if you put those graphs side by side, they look very similar actually. And I did an analysis that I don't have a graph here on purpose. I didn't put that graph in. I made it, but I didn't put it. But when you look at the bottom 10 cards of a deck, you don't see much impact of the bottom 10%, at the bottom 10 card power of the deck on the actual win rate. It is pretty resilient to change, which means that at least in this format, it's the top 10 cards that are good predictor between win rate of the top cards and the win rate of the deck. If you were lazy, you might have equated it with top 10 cards are the most important thing in the deck. You don't care about the rest. You can just put filler in. But if you were lazy, that would have been maybe a decent enough explanation. However, I know my audience. I know my audience is extremely not intellectually lazy. Therefore, of course, you will tell me, don't be silly, Paolo. Of course, it doesn't mean that. It means that the win rate of those bottom 10, of those bottom half of the deck is not a good predictor of winning, because the bottom cards of your deck will often be there for the function reason. These are the cards that we put in our deck, not because of their high win rate, but because of the function they can provide. It's going to be the filler 2-drops. It's going to be the necessary fixing cards that maybe don't have a super high win rate. And win rate is not a good predictor of success there, because function, necessity of having them, alignment with your plan, synergistical things, these are going to be important. While, of course, the power cards are there for power, and because of that, they have high win rate. And if you put high win rate power cards in your deck, they're going to be a good predictor of how the deck is performing. But don't forget that those bottom cards are important. It's just that the win rate is not a very good predictor of the deck success, because they are there not for the win rate. They are there for those things: function, necessity, plan, synergy. So keep that in mind. Okay, and there's one more aspect of luck. Sometimes you just randomly select the optimal color pair. Some drafts you pick one, pick one, and everything works out perfectly, and then you get 2 boxes of Duskmourn again. In some, you just don't. So I looked at, as I said, I looked at optimal paths for each color pair in this analysis. And then I wanted to see what is the difference between the max and min optimal paths for each color combination in each draft. And what is the difference between the two. And some drafts are very close to each other. So the difference between the optimal path for best color and the optimal path for the worst color pair was below 1 percentage point. And in some drafts, you have quite a large divergence. The difference between the best optimal path for one color pair, best color pair, and the worst color pair was above 2 percentage points, above even 2.5 percentage points. And as we said, 2 percentage points is a lot when you think that we're talking about 20 cards, each of them having 2 percentage points higher win rate. This is a colossal difference in terms of power between your decks. So does this difference between the best path and the worst path link to win rate? That's what I wanted to check, and that's what I asked my chat during the break. And most people said that they think that smaller difference between the best and worst path that you can take will mean that you are going to be winning more. And I tested that exactly. And I also guessed when I did this graph that that would be the case. However, what I found is that the bigger the difference between the best and the worst path, the higher the win rate. And I can't fully explain it. I think it might have something to do that if there is a very apparent best path, you will most likely identify it as a drafter, or at least more frequently you will identify it, and you end up in it, and then you have a busted deck. That's the best explanation I did come up with. However, I'm not 100% sure. I just think it's a very interesting result because it was counterintuitive for me, and it was counterintuitive to at least 4 or 5 people in the chat. And usually, if you're hardcore enough to be in the chat when I'm recording this, you are probably interested in data and you think about it enough. So I think it is interesting, and I'm eagerly awaiting on being blue skied at after you listen to this as a podcast episode, and with your explanation of why do you think drafts that are more uneven in terms of difference between the best and the worst path are so much better than the ones that are relatively egalitarian. Because my working hypothesis was that if you are in the even draft, the chance of you picking a good path is higher because every path is good, because the difference between the min and the max is very small. But it turns out that you want lopsided packs because probably you can identify the best path through that more frequently than not, and you are going to be winning much more. Whew. And with that, I think that's it. This is one of my episodes when I try new analyses, and of course they are a bit unpolished and rough, but sometimes those unpolished and rough analyses get expanded in the next sets. And again, if you think that there are some things I should have been looking at, I'm very keen on the suggestions on what else I could analyze in this. Hopefully you know a bit more about luck and skill. And I think that the most important takeaway is that, yes, 10% of your wins will be a result of good or bad draft pods. But those things sort of even out in the long term, first of all. And second of all, you don't have any influence over being in a good or a bad pod. And there is still the 90% of other factors that you can try to control. And as I've shown you, I hope convincingly, good players outperform what they open regularly. Try to be in this group of good players and outperform your pods in terms of the power of the deck you draft. You're going to be so much better off for that. Also, one thing that I showed today, people that are having around 40% win rate, they can't cope with good, bad pods. It doesn't really matter, which means the problem is with the player. And knowing that is important. And it might sound rough, but that's the reality. If you want to improve, you need to make sure that you start navigating those drafts better, because navigation of the drafts is clearly a problem there if you are ending with the same win rate in powerful pods and in the same win rate with weak pod. All right. And with that, I would like to thank the 17 Lens teams for providing the data. As always, they're amazing. And also thanks to Fake Jake Brown, who I should change to Blue Sky now, but who can even track what nickname does the Fake Jake Brown have now in the socials, as it changes every week. Be consistent like me. No one can spell my nickname, but at least it's consistent across multiple platforms. And with that, I'll see you next week when we'll be talking about I have no idea what. Bye.